Thanks very much. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation. I've had already an amazing 2 or 3 days in Tel Aviv hearing stories of fantastic audience engagement. And that last lecture was a really great grounding, wasn't it, in the history of the theory of spectatorship and audiencing. So I'm really looking forward to sharing some ideas with you from my experience as a practitioner and as an academic, thinking about audiences, but also fighting for audiences, really. So I've called this talk a plea for audiences, because as we heard in the last session, audiences have forever really been marginalised and discriminated against and forgotten and ridiculed and treated with lots of fear and suspicion. And I think, you know, we're obviously in really, really challenging situation at the moment, but it's actually quite an exciting time, I think, for the cultural sector, for audiences, and there are real opportunities, I think, to engage with our publics and communities and audiences in very, very different ways. So what I'm hoping to do this evening, in the next kind of 45 minutes, is think through some of these main ideas, look at how the context is changing, thinking about, you know, what is driving change? What are these geopolitical forces, sociological forces, cultural and aesthetic forces that are gradually, but I think radically changing the way that producers and audiences are engaging and interacting. I'm going to talk about some of the key terminology. And we had a great conversation yesterday about how, of course, these are very different in English and Hebrew. So we have a real problem with the word audience in English, which of course comes from the Latin audire, which means, you know, to hear, to listen to. And so, and in French, kind of, you know, spectateur, this idea of someone who watches at one distance removed, again, as we heard from that great example of Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, and the gaze in the last lecture. So audiences have historically been reduced to people who engage with one sense. They listen, or they see, but they stand removed and they're not part of the actual performance at all. And that's really problematic. So I'm going to try and unpick some of this thinking, this really troublesome terminology. I'm going to talk a lot about engagement. And again, you know, engagement apparently isn't a word that you can translate easily into Hebrew, this concept of audience engagement. But you do apparently have a great word for audience, which I've forgotten. So someone tell me. Yeah, which I love, this idea of being together, being part of a community. It's so much richer than our word audience. So I think you're already one step ahead in that the etymology that you use, some of the language, is much more receptive to the way that audiences are shifting and behaving in the future. So, you know, you're one step ahead of us already. But these related concepts like participation, like co-creation, for example, are really ambiguous and really slippery. And we were talking in the last session with the Arts Council here about some of these terms and about what it means to co-create with communities, with audiences, how tastes are changing, for example. And if you read, I'm sure all of you have, the Arts Council England strategy, Let's Create. I sadly have, it's my day job to read these strategies. But they're full of these terms. And everybody understands something slightly different from, say, co-creation. And of course, there's good co-creation and there's bad co-creation. So how do we get it right? And I'm certainly not going to give you a formula or a recipe. But I am going to throw out some ideas and some challenges and some provocations. As I was introduced, you know, lead the Centre for Cultural Value. So of course, I am really interested in questions of value and again in how these various and often competing manifestations and understandings of economic value versus social value versus cultural or aesthetic value, how these are coming into play with one another. So I'm going to think of what value does co-creation and participation have for audiences in 2022? What value does it have for artists, and how do we know? And then finally, I'm going to talk through some of the conditions, the considerations, and the challenges and perhaps barriers to this kind of practice. What is it about audience engagement that presents barriers to doing it really well, and what can we learn from some case studies of good practice? And then finally, think through what does all this mean in 2022 for our artists, our organisations, for people like me studying audiences. Where is the future of audience research, and what does it mean for funders and policymakers? So what are these drivers of change? We've had, as I said, a brilliant kind of history of performance studies already, so I'm not going to go over all of this, but I often start from this idea of relational art. Most of you will know the work of Debord from the 1990s, but really this idea that art has a social purpose. Of course it does. It's often political, as we've just seen, but really this kind of principle that the point of art really is to bring people together. And I've been talking this week about sharing some examples of Nina Simon, who some of you will know, an American museum curator, who writes about how museums can be more participatory. And she famously talks about art as a dog. So when you're walking your dog in the street, people kind of talk over the dog and about the dog, and it's a brilliant way, a bit like babies, of bringing strangers together and giving them something meaningful to talk about. So she challenges all to think about art as that dog, and how it can be used to bring together fractured communities, marginalised demographics in our community, and how ultimately it can be used to have participatory cultural venues. And if ever we needed participatory, open cultural venues, I think it's in the UK and in Israel in 2022. So nothing's really changed, I don't think, in terms of this vital importance of relational art and really good participatory practice. Some other drivers, I think, are the democratization of creativity and engagement. We're seeing audiences demand a closer role in cultural production. We're seeing, especially younger audiences, really want to get involved and be often part of the performance itself. So companies like Punch Drunk are really, really good examples of this. And certainly during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw an explosion of creativity at home. So this notion of everyday creativity that really brought comfort and solace to lots of people in very, very hard times. So I think, there are opportunities here, aren't there, for the cultural sector, for all of us in the room, to slightly shift the way we think about what we do in our day jobs, to maybe think of ourselves more as facilitators or conduits of creativity rather than producers of professional art that is pushing it down through marketing onto consumers. So I'm going to kind of attack the neoliberal approaches to audiencing and marketing this evening. We're seeing blurring boundaries, of course, between art and entertainment, between what used to be called high culture and low culture, especially as younger audiences' tastes evolve, and we're seeing more hybrid artistic forms emerge that we didn't have before. And certainly in the UK, we've seen quite a radical shift in funding towards new art forms and away from even really established organisations like English National Opera. I'm sure some of you have read about the crisis that's happening in the art world in London, everyone stamping their feet and demanding answers from the Arts Council, who were brave enough to shift funding to new organisations who are more focused on audiences who've been historically marginalised from public funding of culture. So we're seeing quite radical change in England at the moment, which is, whatever your stance on this, I think interesting to analyse and to observe where it ends up. In terms of the wider context, we have this notion of the experience economy, of course, from the late kind of 1990s, Pine and Gilmore, saying how everybody, consumers in general, they don't want products anymore, they don't even just want services, they want really great experiences. And if we can do one thing in the cultural sector, presumably, it is to produce fantastic experiences for people. So the thinking here is that we have a real advantage in the 2020s as a cultural sector. We do produce these memorable, meaningful experiences. And people like Bill Sharp are starting to talk about the economy of meaning. People have had enough of consuming all the time. They want to self-identify via their cultural engagement and cultural productivity on their own terms. We're seeing, again, as we saw in the last session, this participatory turn, as Crawford calls it, as citizens in general want to get more involved and have a voice and have a say and have a stake and be treated as partners in a cultural endeavour rather than recipients of cultural products. And that's very much part of European Union's policy on culture and strategies, is to really think how culture can produce better citizens who are more engaged with democratic states. We're seeing changing modes of consumption. We talked again today about attention spans and people being almost literally tethered to their mobile devices and the implications of that for cultural production, cultural reception, for engaging with all sorts of art. So what does that mean? How can we move beyond it, and how actually can we engage with that, engage with digital technologies for something really, really productive? And then we're seeing this blurring, aren't we, of people who produce culture and people who consume. I hate the word consume when it's used with culture, but these terms, these neologisms like prosumers or collaborative consumers, the point really being that it's getting harder and harder to distinguish between people who are making culture and people who are on the consumption end of cultural engagement and activities. So we're seeing a real blurring and a kind of democratization of who has the right to produce and engage with culture. And then you throw into that, of course, technology. Even Web 2.0 is old-fashioned now. We have this metaverse, which apparently is going to transform all of our online engagement in the next 10 years or so, Zuckerberg hopes. And all sorts of theories and aspirations and visions around digital that again exploded, of course, in the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm going to share a few thoughts about the possible futures of digital engagement. How can we use that to our advantage as a sector, and what maybe do we need to be a little bit sceptical about? And finally, just this obvious context of not just COVID-19, but as we've emerged, or as we are emerging gradually from that particular pandemic, this idea that we're actually now existing in what's called a perma-crisis. The idea that, whether it's the climate crisis or the cost of living crisis or geopolitical wars, etc., it is the new normal. So what does that mean for cultural practitioners and for cultural organisations who have to constantly engage with audiences in various different crises? So, context, how did we get here? Going back to the ideas and theories of Raymond Williams, this idea of culture and creativity, not just being the product of individual feeling, but much more about being a general communication. So again, very much informing ideas of relational art, but really how arts and culture can be used to bring people together for the collective good. And as Csikszentmihalyi here famously says, creativity is a phenomenon that is constructed through an interaction between producers and audience. So this idea of creativity not being a cultural product or an output, but being actually residing in that engagement, in the interaction, in the relationship between producers of culture and audiences. So he goes on to say, creativity is not the product purely of single individuals, of the divine artist, of Michelangelo, etc., but of social systems. So I think what we've been seeing over the last century is this broadening of creativity, really permeating society, this idea of audiences emerging from the dark, where they've been silenced to engage with sacred art for far too long, and a real coming together, an explosion of that mediation, that idea of culture is something that happens in between, in that third space between the artist and the audience. And it's worth, I think, bearing in mind Bourdieu's warning that if we don't get this right, and if we have a too closed system of cultural production, then this can act as what he calls an interminable circuit of interlegitimation. So this idea of solipsism, of a very tiny elite talking to itself, of preaching to the converted, of seeing in audiences people that we always mix with every day, this fracturing of society playing out in our concert halls and dance studios. So as my colleague at Leeds, Leila Yankovic, argues, this narrow band of voices really militates against change and innovation. So in other words, change management is absolutely key. Understanding how we can work with artists and cultural organisations to do things differently, to respond to some of these drivers, is going to be increasingly important. We've just published a new, this is not a plug for the new book actually, because it was far too heavy for me to bring lots of copies of this companion. But I was a co-editor of this new Routledge companion to audiences in the performing arts that was published earlier this year. And I thought it just might be interesting to kind of share the kind of recurrent themes that we covered in that book, to give you a kind of overview of where we as 4 editors based around the globe think that audience research is going and where it's kind of coming from. And I haven't got time, of course, to go through all of these in detail, but just to give you a taste of where our authors thought audience research was in 2022. The first kind of cluster of themes was this idea of histories of audience practice, and again, we've just heard a brilliant illustration of that history, of audiences being part of the polis, going back to Plato, this disruptive force that is absolutely engaged in the debates of the day, through to Shakespearean times in terms of my context, where audiences were bawdy and loud, and fortunately that isn't the case today, I hope, but people throwing bananas and fruit and beer at each other and at the artists, to the Enlightenment, ironically called the Enlightenment, because in the context of certainly France and the UK, that meant audiences being put in rows and absolutely silenced and acquiesced in front of sacred art. So we've had this kind of 360-degree transformation of audience behaviour and practice, and lots of the authors in this companion trace those various phases of how artists and audiences have interacted over the centuries. There's a cluster of research, really interesting research around methods. Interesting and methods don't always go in the same sentence, but there are some really pioneering methodologies that are explored in this companion. For example, looking at biometrics, the way that audiences' brains behave when they're engaged with live art. This idea, the kind of emerging biological evidence that when audiences are together in a full house with live performance, their brainwaves start to sync and their heartbeats start to sync with one another. Which of course raises all sorts of interesting possibilities, I think, about the power of art and culture to develop empathy and again to heal and mend fractured communities and societies. So lots around methods and shifting paradigms and creative ways of understanding and and getting under the skin of the audience experience that we're starting to see. There were lots of articles and chapters around cultural policy, of course, and participation. In the UK, most of my colleagues looking at cultural policy are actually looking at who isn't engaging with arts and culture, which is, of course, vitally important. But there are more people who look at who isn't engaging than who is engaging. So I think I'm one of the kind of minority of researchers looking at what is it about those audiences that are regular, what's happening in their brains, in their hearts, in their bodies, what are their drivers and motivations for engaging in the first place. So there's a whole kind of, looking at justifications for public funding, evolving demographics, and of course questions of audience development, which we're thinking about very much this evening. So how can we attract new audiences? And it's again been brilliant this week to hear some fantastic initiatives happening in Tel Aviv with younger audiences. That we have very few of those initiatives in the UK. And again, there are very few academic studies published about how to engage younger audiences. And if we don't want our audiences to die out, then this is absolutely where the future of audience research needs to be. How are we going to attract that next generation of audience, I think, is one of the key questions of our generation. We have arts marketing scholars and management scholars looking at theories, and I'm going to talk a bit in a minute about marketing and some of the evils of marketing, as well as the possibilities and potentials of marketing. Increasingly, we're seeing an interest in what I've called here value and impact research. Obviously, I'm doing a lot of that at the Centre for Cultural Value, but this idea of how do we evaluate the value of audiences engaging with arts and culture? How can we make the case to policymakers? How can we take funders and policymakers on that journey of what to fund, for whom and why? I think historically there's been a real gap in audience research looking at questions of power and elitism, and obviously in the UK we're obsessed with class and our class system and how reductive and damaging that has been and continues to be. So any of you interested in class or in English mores, there is a brilliant chapter by Maria Barrett who looks at how theatres in the UK are particularly starting to engage with working class audiences through their programming, through their food and drink offer, for example, through the physiology of spaces. So there's quite a cluster of researchers now looking at the importance of spaces and venues and how they can be used to break down barriers to engagement. We have another little cluster looking at reception theory and semiotics, a pretty well-established tradition in audience research, very, very important, of course, to understand exactly what's going on in the decoding process, so how audiences make sense of performance collectively and individually. We have a trend, of course, globally, I think, of more immersive, more interactive performance. So increasingly, we're seeing academics try and unpick some of that and try and deconstruct what's happening in these immersive experiences, which are often extolled to be the only way forward to engage certainly younger audiences. I've talked about venues and spaces and places, but there were some lovely case studies in the companion around the intimacy of, say, jazz spaces and how those kinds of smaller spaces can engender a really intimate, special relationship between audience members and jazz artists. That kind of informality of just having a beer and a glass of wine and a conversation after a piece of music or in between as a kind of interlude. So very much the theme of this conference, I think, by the sounds of it. And there will be time for wine quite soon, I suspect. And then young audiences. So there are a couple of chapters really looking at the experiences of young audiences, again, trying to analyse some of those challenges and barriers, looking at programming, looking at production, and looking at tactics and initiatives to bring younger audiences into the picture. So that wasn't a plug for the book, it was really just to give you a kind of an overview of the spectrum of research. And I should also say it was really challenging. We did our best to get voices from around the world for this companion, and we managed to get people, academics from Bangladesh, from Ghana, from Australia, America. Sadly, we didn't have any Israeli contributors. But of course, there were huge gaps in audience research. I hear there isn't a lot of audience research happening in Israel, so hopefully this conference can start to stimulate discussion about, not just academics, but cultural policymakers and practitioners thinking together through these really important and difficult, but I would say fascinating facets of audience research. Okay, so I'm going to think through some of the key challenges now of audience research. I've already talked about the etymology, the problem of linguistics and how limiting some of these terms are, but also how we're often talking at cross purposes with ourselves and with our colleagues when we talk about spectatorship or audiencing. I mean, we have to even make words up to make them fit into the language. And when we talk about, say, co-creation, one company or organisation will understand one thing by that, and someone else will have a completely different interpretation of what that means. And that raises huge challenges, I think, for funders and policymakers trying to develop meaningful strategies that everyone can cohere around. We've got a kind of infrastructure challenge with audience research as well, in terms of where it sits and where scholars of audiencing come from. So actually Tal asked me this evening, what kind of, is it common in the UK for audience researchers to be in theatre departments or dance departments or cultural studies departments? And the answer is, you find audience researchers everywhere. We're real kind of polymaths and very multidisciplinary, which is great and really rich in one sense, but really problematic in terms of audience research is very fragmented. It often sits with business and management and marketing, and other times in psychology or sociology or cultural studies, or within art forms like opera studies, performance studies, dance studies. So that's I think at the same time a real source of richness and a real problem, because it's very difficult therefore to develop the field or the discipline of audience research. We don't even have a name for what it is, and we argued in our introduction between the four of us about what is this thing called? Is it audience studies? Is it audience research? Is it cultural studies? Is it a subdiscipline? Very academic arguments, but actually quite telling, I think, of how far behind some of this theorising is around audiences. I think we also come from a position of defensiveness often as audience researchers. So even people like Blau, some of you may have read Blau, who is an audience researcher, is very, very disdainful about audiences. And he talks about this tradition of disdain and what he calls disconcerted ambivalence towards the audience. And he says many people who work in theatre and dance and performing arts perceive spectators as a kind of usurper or intruder. This idea, I find it just astonishing that audiences are a kind of a necessary evil. And I've certainly met artists who genuinely believe that, that they need to buy their tickets to keep an organisation going, but they're really, they're really complicated, noisy and messy, and they say things that we don't want to hear. And they tell us things about our art that we really don't want to hear. So there's nothing new in this disdain towards audiences, and I hope one of the things that we as a community of people interested in audiences will achieve is to move beyond this disdain. Argue that this is a really valid academic pursuit and discipline in its own right, and that audiences have the most right to be in the venue and in the space, because without audiences there is arguably very little point in art and culture at all. It's controversial, and please attack me if you want to for that. The other big problem we have is methods, as I was alluding to before. So how can we understand audiences? We're all, I'm sure, sick and tired of filling in really bad surveys at the end of a performance, or being asked our opinion, or having to give a vox pop as you leave a piece of theatre or dance or whatever, or an exhibition. So we have to move beyond the bad survey. But there are all sorts of interesting ways to do it, again, that people are starting to experiment with. So, you know, hanging out with audiences. So one of the projects I did as part of the initial cultural value project was to spend not the whole 2 weeks, but over a 2-week festival. There were 5 researchers and we were paired off with 5 audience members. And those audience members curated their own journey through that festival, and wherever we could, we used to go along with them. And often we would, you know, we'd have a beer beforehand and a conversation to get to know each other. We'd go and see a piece of art together, and we'd go and talk about it afterwards. And it was terrifying as a researcher. You know, the first thing my buddy said to me was, so what were you looking for? What were your questions? Where's the survey? And I said, I have literally a blank piece of paper. So it wasn't a comfortable place to be in. It was just to be, you know, to hang out with audiences, to kind of see it through their eyes and get that life story. But what it did do was elicit, of course, really rich stories of various times in people's lives where art and culture had been absolutely transformational. Whether that was, you know, an auntie giving them some coloured pens when they were 7 years old, or doing English literature A-level, or some of the brilliant, you know, jazz performances they'd been to, etc. So these kind of methods that use art as a stimulus for deeper, richer conversations, I think, are important. And I always say to arts marketers, hang out at the bar and listen to what your audiences are saying. You know, get your box office staff and your front of house staff to talk, God forbid, to talk to audiences and have a dialogue with them. And that happens so rarely. So we're often missing a trick in audience research within our cultural organisations. I think, you know, I know we often sell tickets far too expensively. We get audiences in, we give them a very bad, cheap glass of white wine for far too much money. We show them the theatre and then we close it down and kick them out without any kind of human hosting or interaction or asking them if they've had a good time. So we need to be better hosts, and we really need to make audiences feel welcome, that they can stay, that they have as much right to be in that space as artists and marketeers and managers do. We have all sorts of issues about trust. So we know that audiences can be overly positive, and they can often tell marketeers and researchers what we want to hear, well, not what I want to hear, what they think we want to hear, which is that they had a great time and the art was fantastic. So it's very difficult to get around this, you know, this positive bias. So we really need to find ways of, you know, whether that is biometrics or more subtle ways of finding out what audiences really think as opposed to what they say they think. And I think ultimately, you know, what we're trying to do at the Centre for Cultural Value is have people-centred evaluation methods, where we absolutely prioritise the voice of participants and audiences, so that we move beyond this culture of making assumptions about audiences and homogenising. You know, we often talk about the audience. I mean, what does that mean? Who is the audience? The audience is as plural as the number of people in that audience. So we need to move beyond that, and we need to move away from really damaging generalisations about audience experience. I think another problem we have is what I would call role conflict. So, and I'm sure we've all experienced this, either as audience members, or as artists, or as producers, or as all of those things. But what on earth are we supposed to be doing? What do organisations want us to be? So one day we're a consumer and we're being told to buy a ticket. That's fine. We all, you know, we need to make some money. We're also called guests, and not enough, but some cultural organisations are trying to be really good hosts, and they're really trying to think and conceive and treat their audiences as guests in their open house, if you like. We're sometimes expected to be, or want to be, co-producers, co-creators, co-curators of festivals. So we have great examples globally, but certainly in the UK, of theatres giving away their stages, their theatres for a whole week to, say, young companies to take over and co-create or actually produce a festival. On a Wednesday, you might be asked to be a champion or an ambassador or a friend or join a members scheme of a cultural organisation, to be a patron, to be a donor, to be a philanthropist, to be a participant, to be a volunteer, to be a partner, which is probably my favourite term of all of these terms, is this idea of what would it look like if we had a cultural sector that treated audiences as partners, where we did things together, where we developed our missions and our strategies and our programmes together. And by that I don't mean giving full control of autonomy to the audience, because that would be chaotic and crazy. But having touch points and moments where audiences can come in and genuinely feel like they have ownership of an organisation is increasingly important if we're not going to lose this next generation of audiences. So there are real questions here, aren't there, for organisations who treat different departments of organisations, different functions, whether it's marketing, fundraising, programming, front of house, box office. We treat audiences in all of these different ways and basically expect far too much of them with very little understanding of what they want. So I promised you briefly to give you some definitions, and I had a great chat with 2 or 3 of you the other night about this term audience development. And I kind of provocatively said, if it were up to me, I would ban the term audience development. And I'll say a bit more later of why I would do that. But this is how variously audience development is defined. So first of all, this idea of changing the structure and composition of audiences to achieve some more democratic participation in the arts. It's pretty standard, I guess, understanding of audience development. And the second is from 12 years ago, from Arts Council England. I like this definition because they say, as an ethos, audience development places the audience at the heart of everything the organisation does, which clearly is aspirational, but it's a really great aspiration. And again, I love to kind of speculate at my 2 AM moments of insomnia what that organisation might look like if genuinely audiences were at the heart of everything the organisation did. And then we have audience engagement. And again, I know you don't have a direct translation, so maybe that's good, actually, because audience engagement means lots of things, and it needs to be, a holistic term and a holistic concept. But it really, certainly in English, in English language, engagement comes from the old French word engager, which means to bind together or to pledge something, which I think is a really nice symbol and metaphor, isn't it, for what we want our audiences to do. So how can organisations and artists bind audiences to them? Again, I think is quite a nice question. And then we have theories like Sashi here saying that effective audience engagement establishes intimate bonds, which can create enduring exchanges between producers and audiences to affect loyalty and delight. So, this idea really that the holy grail, I suppose, of our relationships with audiences is generating meaningful long-term relationships in the way that we would with someone on a date. But it's how do we have more human relationships and less transactional relationships with audiences that is the key question here. And then there's a predominantly American term. I don't know if you use this here, do you? This idea of audience enrichment. It's starting to creep in more into strategies and policies in the UK, but it really comes from the USA, and particularly from Lynn Connor, who was one of the co-editors on the Rutledge Companion. And I'm just going to read this out, actually, because I think it's a really great argument for the way in which good audience engagement can enrich the experience for everybody. So Lynn says, a viable philosophy and practice of audience enrichment is centred on the assumption that what an audience really wants is the opportunity to co-author the arts experience. It's a really great phrase, I think, isn't it? To co-author the arts experience. She says they want the opportunity to participate in an intelligent and responsible way in telling its meaning. They want to have a real forum or several forums for the interplay of ideas, experience, data, and feeling that makes up the arts experience. So it's a fantastic book, actually, and I'd really, really recommend it. Lynn's book's called Arts Talk. And she argues that, in the USA, and it's certainly the same in Europe and here at the moment, you walk into a cafe or a bar, and where, football and sport is ubiquitous. So we have this absolute culture of sports talk. And what would it look like if we had a culture of arts talk, where the general public could not get too far away from, conversations about arts, commentary about arts, it being on the national news, it being on buses, it being in advertising, as someone was suggesting the other night as well. So this culture of arts talk that we're so far away from, but I think the question is really, what can we do to stimulate that, to move closer towards a culture of arts talk? And people often, when I'm teaching this to students, they often say, so, what's the relationship between these concepts, between audience development and audience engagement and audience enrichment? And that's how I see it, really. I see that, the goal of good audience engagement is enriching, enduring relationships between organisations and artists and audiences. And audience development, horrible term though it is that idea of working with existing audiences and taking them on that artistic journey, but it's also going out of the organisation, really importantly, into communities and bringing in new audiences, diversifying that demographic base that we know is so unrepresentative of our populations. But in order to do that, we really do need to understand, different typologies of engagement. So I think a really fair challenge to people like me who often talk about, and extol co-creation and co-creative practice and participatory practice, is that not all audiences want to co-create. I certainly don't. I'm one of those terrible people who wants to sit in silence at the back and just switch off and enjoy and let the professional artist do that, and that's fine. So I find this spectrum of audience involvement really, really useful, actually. So it's by, some of you will know Alan Brown, who is an arts consultant in Chicago. And I think what's interesting here is, again, the kind of acknowledgement that there are, of course there are more than 5 types of audience, of course there are. But what's interesting here is that Alan Brown segments audiences by their propensity to engage in different ways. And I think that raises questions about how well organisations know their audiences. And that will be different in every organisation. The proportion of people who are, like me, spectators, and the other extreme who are artists, and they want to be on that stage, and they want to be working with you, and programming with you, and dancing with you on your stages. And in the middle, you have these ideas of co-creative practice, and crowdsourcing, and enhanced engagement. So I think an interesting challenge around segmenting and understanding audiences in a very different way. So I'm going to end, or the last kind of 10 minutes, I'm going to try and debunk what I think are 3 big myths about audiences. So the first is my pet topic of this idea that audiences need to be developed. I mean, how patronising is that? This idea that, cultural policy scholars would call it the cultural deficit model, wouldn't they? But this idea that there's something wrong with audiences, that they're deficient, that they don't understand it, that they're too stupid to really engage with art, but they won't get it anyway, that it was a really bad audience. We've all heard these phrases in our venues, haven't we? So I don't think audiences need to be developed. I think they need to be engaged with. I think organisations need to be developed to engage with audiences on their terms and in a much more productive and effective way. So I would ask, is active spectatorship a tautology? Again, we saw brilliant examples of that in the last lecture. All audiences are active. We're all sitting there doing a lot of cognitive work, a lot of emotional empathy and engagement. We may be tapping our feet and engaging in a very kinesthetic way. There are very few audiences who are passive. So this myth of the passive audience member, I think, is a really outdated one and a really dangerous one. And if audiences are passive, then whose fault's that? It's probably because they are. It's pretty bad. And it's not engaging people. You know, if you're all falling asleep, that's because I'm not doing my job very well. And I think that absolutely stands for artists and arts organisations. The terminology is really difficult. I think this point again from Alan Brown that we do need to have a shared understanding of these concepts, and they're underdeveloped. And they're often, you know, even within a small region, we wouldn't have a shared understanding of what we mean by effective participation and how to make it happen. So we do need more resources to understand these concepts and to have a collective understanding of how to make them work. So audience development, let's ban it. It never comes from the audience's perspective. It's usually very, very instrumental. And in all honesty, in 70 years of cultural policy in the UK, it has absolutely failed to change the demographics of who engages with publicly funded arts and culture. We still have around 8% of the population who are, of course, disproportionately white, disproportionately graduates or postgraduates, and disproportionately in our metropolitan centres who are the beneficiaries of public spending on arts. And, you know, that's unacceptable. So let's not talk about audience development, let's talk about audience engagement, let's talk about public engagement. And you know, I love the fact that in France and Spain and Italy that, you know, the word for audience is public or publico, this idea that there isn't a distinction between the general public and our audiences. Whereas in the UK there absolutely is. If you talk about the public, that means people who don't go, people who aren't audiences. There's a real tension between those terms. So let's think about public engagement and citizenship, instead of engaging in this damaging, value-based and quite elitist hierarchy of participation. So that's myth number one. Myth number two is that audiences are consumers, which is slightly cheeky because, of course, audiences on one level can be consumers, but they're not just consumers. And again, we're treating them in such a reductive way if we think about them in terms of consumption and ticket buying. And I've certainly worked as a consultant with cultural organisations who I shan't shame and name, who they don't even talk about audiences, they talk about the building and the box office, as if those are kind of, you know, the all-important entities of their business model. So this real need, I think, to become much, much more relational, to think about audiences as human beings, you know, as people with emotions, people who have a hunger to be engaged spiritually and intellectually and emotionally, and all of those things that Lynn Connor highlighted in her definition of audience enrichment. So we have a lot of work to do. People like Miranda Boersma have pointed out that, you know, arts marketing is too based in business and management and strategic thinking. It's not enough influenced by aspects of philosophical aesthetics. So we need, you know, a much more of a marriage of where audiencing has come from, as opposed to this very harmful divide between the business side of an organisation and the artistic side of an organisation. So in my work on audience engagement, I really try and shift the terminology away from marketing, which is predominantly transactional, towards engagement, which is predominantly relational. So anyone who's studied marketing will have learned, I'm sure, the 4 Ps, the famous 4 Ps, product, price, place, promotion. You know, the theory is if you get that right, then you will get your marketing right and your audiences will flock in. And I wonder what would it look like if we changed those 4 Ps into 4 Es. And instead of products, we talked about experiences. And instead of price, we talked about an exchange between artists and audiences. Instead of place, we think about the environment in all the senses of that term, especially with the climate crisis in our minds. And instead of promotion, which feels again like this push of content towards consumers. Let's talk about engagement. And that's hard, and it's time consuming, and it's challenging, and it doesn't always pay off in 3 weeks in the way that traditional marketing might. But it certainly pays off in the long term, in terms of the bottom line, and in terms of that long-term loyalty, and in terms of the quality of feedback and conversation you get back from audiences. So I would argue that, you know, this experience or relational paradigm is a win-win. And we need to make that case to our artistic directors, our funders, our policymakers, if we're going to get rid of this awful 20th century reductive neoliberal treatment of our audiences and actually treat them like 21st century people. So let's have audiences as partners. And linked to that, you know, I think we really need to understand more about co-creation, because it often has a bad reputation, it's often missed or poorly understood, but quite simply, you know, it can be referred to as what Charles Ledbetter says, the art of with. So doing things with people, with our participants and with our audiences, rather than on them or to them. You know, changing cultural activity from production to creation with. What does that mean in terms of our production processes, in terms of our engagement and marketing models? We have Gauvier here, who describes co-creation as a collaborative journey. It's a really nice metaphor again, that organisations need to go on to create something new together. And then finally, Hannah Rudman, who talks about co-creation as a new form of organisational porosity. And she says the free exchange of creative energy that can be produced by effective co-creation. So I particularly like this idea of our organisations being more open, more porous, more transparent, more welcoming, inviting people in and treating them as partners and guests, and ultimately being good hosts. And there are lots of reasons to co-create. So again, you know, if you are a champion of co-creation and you're challenged by directors about why you would endorse doing this within an organisational context, we know that co-creation is one of the most significant trends in society. I mean, people are producing and designing cars online. So if people can produce cars online and design cars online, they can certainly co-create our cultural products and activities. We know, as Caldwell says, that co-creative practices are an integral part of artistic experiences, and our audiences engage in cognitive, emotional, imaginal practices to appropriate and make sense of a cultural product. So this idea that co-creation doesn't always mean developing product and outputs with participants. It means collective meaning making. It means having moments and touch points where together you make sense of the art that you have enjoyed together. And the business argument here, lots of studies demonstrating that co-creation can maximize the lifetime value of desirable customer groups. So this 8% I was talking about of highly educated, highly creative, highly artistic audience members, why wouldn't you want to engage with those people? So there's a really strong economic, financial, business case to be made for good co-creation. It's not just a fluffy, nice, you know, trendy, politically correct thing to be doing. And finally here, again, Miranda Boersma arguing that effective co-creation can fulfill the artistic mission. So it's actually about mission delivery in organisations because it develops what she calls artistic exchange relationships. And I just think this kind of language is really, really important to have in our cultural institutions. Do we talk about relationship of artistic exchange, or do we talk about the box office and the bottom line? And we really do need to see that shift. And in terms of, you know, how to co-create value, again, you know, more of Claire Bishop, she's a brilliant thinker, but this idea that relational art is about intersubjective encounters, the idea of art, again, bringing people together and making meaning collectively and collaboratively, which absolutely raises the question again, doesn't it, of artists and organisations being facilitators and conduits of this collective meaning making. this kind of humaneutic circle, if you like. Because we know, as Miranda Balsmer argues here, that audiences play a vital role as co-producers in what she calls the final stage of the art-making process, by giving meaning to the artifact itself through their imaginative powers. So without the audience, art has no meaning, is the theory here. So we need, as lots of scholars like Payne here have argued, a new conceptualization of value and relationship marketing that is much more interactive, longitudinal, individual, and contextual. In other words, let's stop talking about the audience and let's start getting to know our diverse audience members. And let's move away from the very tired transactional paradigm of marketing towards the relational 21st century model of engagement. And what might this look like? So I've said to a few of you, I kind of started my artistic career as a producer at the National Theatre of Scotland. And what we saw around that time, so this was 2006, 7, 8, was all sorts of cultural organisations, through their branding, making it very clear that organisations were actually owned by audiences. It actually got a bit annoying after 2 years, because every organisation rebranded and said, it's your National Theatre, it's your Royal Shakespeare Company, it's your whatever, it's your watershed. But it was a really significant moment of this transference of power and ownership, really, from artistic directors to audiences. And of course, some of that was semantic, of course some of it was PR. But I did quite like our strapline at the time of being a theatre without walls. So, as I said to some of you in the last session, I think National Theatre of Scotland were the first national theatre to be established without its own theatre building. So by its constitution, the National Theatre of Scotland isn't allowed to produce theatre publicly in its own space. It has to engage with the existing ecology and infrastructure, and it has to take theatre to the villages and islands, and there are lots of islands in Scotland, all across the country, to rural areas, to cities, to towns, which is fantastic. So we're seeing, you know, a real opening up of sites and modes of participation, and we're seeing organisations start to radically transform their business models and their modes of engagement with audiences. Which takes me to my final myth, and this idea of, you know, digital being the panacea. If we could only just put all of our cultural content online, it would solve all of the problems, and we'd get our younger audiences back, we'd see diversification in our demographics. And to be honest, at the Centre for Cultural Value, when we embarked on our 15-month-long project looking at the impact of COVID on the cultural industries, we really did hope, you know, we possibly naively, but we had this expectation that digital would, even in a small way, democratise who was engaging with culture. And in the UK reality, that absolutely failed to transpire. So we didn't see new audiences engage with culture. We saw the same audiences engaging a lot more. So a lot more engagements from the same number of engagers. So there is a myth, I think, very sad reality, that, you know, overnight or in the short term, digitisation is not going to shift who is engaging with our arts and culture. But that isn't a reason not to do it, of course. So we also heard wonderful stories and a lot of really rigorous data about disabled audiences who finally were being taken seriously. And because of the pandemic, suddenly all of the barriers that seemed to be there before the pandemic were broken down, and this content magically appeared overnight, and people could consume and engage with arts and culture in their living rooms. So we saw the National Theatre in England completely radically rethink its marketing, you know, and its whole ethos of being all about collaborative consumption and audiencing, to this idea that you can now, you know, they have this new brand called National Theatre at Home. And the marketing was all about, you can enjoy our top actors from your sofa, from your living rooms. So we had this huge shift within 3-4 months of a subscription model to at-home viewing of theatre, which was of course transformational for elderly, invalid and disabled audiences. So we know that effective digital engagement can increase anticipation. If we use digital before cultural experiences and performances, we can whet people's appetites. We can get them in increase their readiness to receive art. We can give them really important context about what inspired choreographers or directors or writers, and again break down some of those intellectual barriers to engagement. And we know from studies that that can increase and enhance their emotional impact with live performance. So again, it's a win-win. It can elongate their experiences. So it can offer us a solution from this, what I was saying before, of get people in at 7 o'clock and kick them out at 9:30 with a very bad glass of white wine. We can have ongoing, enduring, long-term relationships via digital and asynchronous engagement. We can co-create content, we can co-create experiences and value online much more easily than we can face-to-face, of course. And ultimately, we can drive up loyalty and empathy. So, I'm going to conclude with a few final thoughts. It's a truism to say that we're living through a period of transition. We can see it happening every day, and we certainly saw it happen throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. I think a lot of these ideas and a lot of the data and a lot of the evidence that we're seeing now makes a really, really strong argument for the fact that we need to broaden our definitions and perceptions around audiences. And we need to have a much more relational way of thinking about them that is much more nuanced. We know that participation and co-creation can deepen audience engagement and also provide authentic insight to artists. So strategically, it's a win-win, even if ethically you don't think it's necessarily the only reason to do it. But we also know that digital rarely democratizes the arts, and co-creation often appeals, as we saw in Alan Brown's segmentation model, to a very niche group of people. But they are highly prized audiences, and there's a very good reason to do it, as long as you're doing it strategically. So ultimately, I would argue we need to reconceive audiences, we need to think of them as partners, and we need to think of them as guests who we're inviting into their spaces and become really good hosts. And really, ultimately, that means that we have to reconceptualize arts marketing and cultural policy. And that's the job of academics. But we can't do it in isolation. We can only do it as part of communities who care about audiences and cultural practice. So I would argue that future-proof organisations are going to be those that absolutely are artistically led, but that are audience-centric, where audiences, to go back to that Arts Council England definition, are at the heart of everything the organisation thinks or does. And that is how we can create an open habitus and a really vibrant community of practice. So I'm going to conclude with a couple of implications. We need more research. Of course, I would say that. I have a vested interest in getting funds to do more research. But we need to understand more about co-creative practice and about modes of engagement. I think artists need to be clear about their objectives and legacy and engage ethically and authentically with audiences and not treat them as a necessary evil. Policymakers should not rely on co-creation or digital to democratise arts participation. They should invest strategically in digital production and distribution and marketing, but not under the assumption that it will diversify the audience base overnight, because the evidence suggests that it will not do that. I think we absolutely need to think of ourselves as artists and organisations less as producers and more as facilitators and conduits of creativity. We are and we need to be people who enrich cultural and artistic meaning, who stimulate the co-creation of meaning of arts and culture. And that means being a very different kind of organisation. So in the work at the Centre for Cultural Value, we absolutely prioritise reflective learning and practice and sharing stories of failure, for example. So we need to see cultural organisations that become listening organisations, learning organisations, porous and hosting organisations that let people in and actively listen to them to make it collectively better. And this isn't easy. It implies that organisations have to engage all the time, online and face-to-face, and develop these long-term artistic exchange relationships. And that's hard and it's time-consuming. But I think what we can't do anymore is punt all of those resources into marketing, which is so reductive and which treats our audiences purely as consumers rather than partners or guests. And if there is a solution here, I think it absolutely has to be about leadership. Because if our organisations are going to undertake this radical shift, they're only going to do that with buy-in, I'm afraid, from artistic directors, curators, executive directors, producers. Because it has to be a holistic philosophy and ethos. So we need to see very, very different leaders. We've seen the crisis with Me Too of abusive leadership in the arts and culture. We have to move beyond that to leaders who engage in a very fundamentally different way. And we need to move away from this myth of how attractive it is to have the charismatic diva leading our organisations and abusing that power in ways that aren't productive to audiences or to the general public. And a final warning, in case we need one, from Miranda Boersma, who says, if arts and cultural organisations want to survive in the competitive global world of tourism and leisure, they'll have to deepen their audience's capacity to co-create and deepen their engagement through increasingly entire experiences. So in other words, we need to change or die. Thank you very much.